Her ex-husband smirked in court, thinking he had won, until she revealed a truth that changed everything. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as people settled into their seats, anticipating yet another high-profile divorce case. In the center of it all, a man sat with his attorney, radiating confidence. His tailored suit and smug expression made it clear that he expected to win. On the other side of the courtroom sat his soon-to-be ex-wife, her posture straight, her face calm. Unlike him, she wasn't draped in luxury, her outfit was simple yet elegant, her demeanor reserved. But behind her steady gaze lay something unreadable, something that would soon turn this trial upside down. The judge entered, calling the courtroom to order. The ex-husband leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Your Honor," his lawyer began, "this is a clear case. My client was the sole provider, the one who built everything from the ground up. His ex-wife contributed nothing financially and lived a life of comfort entirely at his expense." He glanced toward her, expecting some reaction. She remained impassive. The judge listened carefully, nodding as the lawyer continued listing reasons why she deserved nothing. She was merely a housewife, a dependent. There is no legal reason for her to be awarded any significant assets. A hushed whisper spread across the courtroom. The ex-husband turned toward his ex-wife, the smirk now fully visible. "You should have just accepted my offer," he muttered under his breath. "You're leaving with nothing." She met his gaze for the first time since the trial started, her eyes steady, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. It was not a smile of defeat, nor of bitterness. It was the kind of smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. The judge turned to her attorney. "Do you have anything to add before I rule?" Before she could answer, her mind drifted back to years ago, to the moment she first met him. He had been charming, ambitious, and full of dreams. She had been drawn to his drive, believing in his vision as much as he did. Their relationship moved quickly, and before long, they were married. In those early years, she had been his biggest supporter. She stayed up late helping him draft business plans, researched market trends, and even sacrificed her own aspirations to be by his side. Back then, they didn't have much. They lived in a small apartment, scraping by while he tried to get his company off the ground. She took on odd jobs, doing everything she could to keep them afloat. She handled their finances, managed their home, and ensured he had everything he needed to focus on his work. When he faced setbacks, she was there to encourage him. When he doubted himself, she reminded him why he started. Slowly, success began to trickle in. Deals were signed, profits grew, and his business flourished. With each milestone, he changed. As the company expanded, so did his ego. He started coming home later, taking more business trips, and treating her less like a partner and more like a background character in his life. She dismissed it at first, believing it was just the stress of success. But then came the condescending remarks. "You don't understand business," he would say when she offered advice. "You should just focus on the house." The man she had built a life with was slipping away, and she was slowly being erased from the picture. She had once been full of dreams of her own. Before marriage, she had been a brilliant strategist, with a mind that could analyze numbers and predict market trends with eerie accuracy. She had been on track for a promising career, but when he asked her to put her ambitions aside to support him, she had done so without hesitation. "We're a team," he had told her. "When I succeed, we both succeed." But as the years passed, it became clear that we had turned into him. The business that she had helped shape became something she was no longer allowed to touch. When she questioned financial decisions, he dismissed her. When she suggested ways to improve operations, he laughed at her. "You wouldn't understand," he said with a smirk. "You've been out of the game too long." She had been erased from the narrative, reduced to nothing more than a wife in the background. And then, one day, the final blow came. He sat her down at their lavish dinner table, the same table they had once eaten cheap takeout on when they were struggling, and handed her divorce papers. "It's time we move on," he said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "You'll get a fair settlement, but don't expect much. Let's be honest, you didn't really contribute." His words cut deeper than any betrayal. She had given everything for him, only to be discarded like she was nothing. After the initial shock wore off, she realized that this had been building for years. The signs had been there, the dismissive attitude, the secretive meetings, the way he had started talking down to her in public. She had ignored them, believing that things would eventually return to the way they were. But now, sitting in that courtroom, hearing him openly mock her in front of strangers, she knew there was no going back. His lawyer continued his speech, emphasizing how she had no career, no financial stake, and no reason to receive anything substantial from the divorce. "She lived a comfortable life entirely due to my client's generosity," the lawyer declared, his voice dripping with arrogance. The ex-husband nodded in agreement, glancing at her as if expecting her to break down. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents. "Your Honor," she finally spoke, her voice calm yet firm, "before you rule, I have something important to present." The judge looked intrigued. "Proceed." She placed the documents on the table and met her ex-husband's gaze. "You claimed I contributed nothing. Let's see if that's really true." The courtroom fell silent as the judge flipped through the documents. It wasn't just bank statements or financial records, it was years' worth of business strategies, original blueprints, and financial forecasts. But the most shocking part? Her name was all over them. "These are the original business plans from when the company was first established," she explained. "I drafted them. I created the initial projections. I built the framework that allowed the company to thrive." The ex-husband's smug expression faltered. His lawyer frowned, flipping through the pages, realizing that this was evidence they hadn't accounted for. She continued, her voice steady. "Every major decision that led to your company's success, the ones you took credit for? They started with me." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge turned his attention to the ex-husband, whose face was slowly losing color. The judge adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the documents, flipping through page after page of carefully outlined business strategies, financial projections, and meeting notes, all in her handwriting. The room, once filled with whispers of amusement at her supposed insignificance, now held a suffocating tension. The ex-husband shifted uncomfortably, his confidence cracking. "Your Honor," his lawyer began hastily, "these documents prove nothing. Anyone can claim they contributed to a business. Where is the official acknowledgement?" He gestured dismissively toward her, as if trying to erase her presence entirely. She remained composed, unfazed by the lawyer's condescending tone. "That's an interesting point," she said, reaching for another folder. "I anticipated this argument." She slid a new stack of papers across the table. "These are email correspondences between me and key investors. Early proposals. Drafts of contracts I negotiated." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my ex-husband built a company, but he didn't build it alone. I was there every step of the way, doing the work that he now claims I never did. The judge's eyes narrowed as he scanned the emails, the weight of the evidence shifting the atmosphere in the courtroom. The ex-husband's jaw clenched, his carefully curated image of control slipping away. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently, his confidence now replaced by sheer desperation. His attorney cleared his throat, forcing an unbothered smile. "Your Honor, we cannot verify the authenticity of these emails. We don't know who actually sent them, and besides, even if she was involved in minor aspects, that does not entitle her to half of a multi-million-dollar empire." The argument was weak, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The murmurs returned, this time tinged with skepticism toward the man who had so arrogantly dismissed his wife's contributions. She clasped her hands together, calm and deliberate. "Your Honor, I have no interest in taking what doesn't belong to me," she said, her gaze locking onto her ex-husband's panicked expression. "I only want what's fair. And if we're discussing authenticity," she pulled out one final document. "This is a legally notarized record of my early financial contributions to his business. I invested a portion of my inheritance into his company, money that allowed it to survive its first year." A wave of gasps rippled through the audience. The ex-husband's face turned pale as the judge examined the document, his lips pressing into a thin line. The judge tapped a pen against his desk, his expression unreadable. "This changes the case significantly," he finally said. "We now have reason to believe that the plaintiff played a substantial role in the foundation of the business." The ex-husband's lawyer straightened his tie, scrambling for a counterargument, but before he could speak, an unexpected voice rang through the courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may." A man stood up from the audience, a former business associate, one of the earliest investors in the company. The ex-husband's eyes widened in horror as the man walked toward the front. "I worked closely with both of them when the company was first getting started," he said, directing his attention to the judge. "And I can confirm that she wasn't just a bystander. She was involved in every major decision in those early years. If anyone deserves recognition, it's her." The ex-husband's lawyer attempted to object, but the damage had been done. The judge leaned back, eyes studying the woman who had remained silent for so long. "It seems we need to reconsider everything," he said, his voice firm. The ex-husband's hands clenched into fists as his perfectly crafted narrative collapsed around him. Just minutes ago, he had been certain of his victory, confident that his wife would leave with nothing. But now, the judge was re-examining the case, flipping through evidence that painted an entirely different picture. Given the new information, the judge began, it is clear that the plaintiff's contributions were not only significant but crucial to the company's success. The ex-husband's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, knowing there was little left to argue. The ex-wife remained composed, though a quiet satisfaction flickered in her eyes. She had spent years being dismissed, her efforts ignored, her worth diminished. But now, in front of the very people who had once overlooked her, the truth was undeniable. The judge turned to her. "Do you have any final statements before I make my ruling?" She took a deep breath, then turned to face the man who had underestimated her for so long. "Yes," she said. "I do." She slowly stood, the weight of years of silence finally lifting. "For so long, I let you take credit for what we built together," she said, her voice steady. "Not because I was weak, but because I trusted you. I believed that we were a team, that your success was our success." She let out a small, almost amused sigh. "But I see now that you never saw it that way. You wanted the world to think you did everything alone. And maybe, for a while, you convinced yourself that was true." The ex-husband's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the table. She gestured toward the documents still spread before the judge. But facts don't lie. I was there, from the beginning. I sacrificed my career, my time, my future, all to help you achieve yours. And now, after everything, you want to erase me from the story. She tilted her head slightly. I won't let you. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on her. The ex-husband, for the first time, had nothing to say. The judge cleared his throat. Given all the evidence presented, I am ready to make my ruling. The ex-husband's lawyer stood abruptly, his face tight with frustration. Your Honor, we request a recess to review this new evidence, he said, his voice laced with urgency. These documents were presented at the last moment. My client deserves the right to a proper defense. The ex-husband, who had been silent since his ex-wife's speech, nodded vigorously, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperation. He could feel the case slipping away, and this was his last attempt to regain control. The judge, however, was unimpressed. He tapped his pen against the wooden desk, his eyes shifting between the two parties. Counselor, your client had every opportunity to present a complete and truthful account of his financial and business dealings. Instead, he chose to omit key information. A recess will not change the fact that the plaintiff's contributions have been legally and undeniably established. He let out a long breath before delivering his final words. Your request is denied. We will proceed with the ruling. The ex-husband's fingers curled into fists, his carefully crafted image unraveling in front of the entire courtroom. His lawyer sat down heavily, knowing that any further objections would only embarrass them further. The judge turned to the woman, his expression neutral but firm. Given the substantial evidence provided, it is clear that the plaintiff was instrumental in the founding and development of the defendant's company. As such, she is entitled to a fair division of assets. He turned a page in his notes before continuing. In light of the financial contributions and intellectual property involved, I am awarding the plaintiff 50% of all business-related assets, including revenue shares and investments. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The ex-husband's face turned ghostly pale, his breath caught in his throat. 50%? He had expected to walk away victorious, leaving his ex-wife with nothing. Now, she was walking away with half of everything he had built, or rather, what they had built. The ex-husband's hands trembled as he gripped the table, his mind spinning with disbelief. This is ridiculous, he hissed under his breath, but the panic in his eyes betrayed his forced bravado. His wealth, his empire, everything he had once taken for granted, was now slipping through his fingers. The courtroom's murmurs grew louder, some spectators exchanging knowing glances. The arrogance that once surrounded him had vanished, leaving only the raw fear of a man who had finally been held accountable. His ex-wife, in contrast, remained composed. She had not fought for revenge, nor had she sought to destroy him. All she had wanted was fairness. And now, after years of being overlooked and disrespected, she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. She met his gaze, not with malice, but with something far more unsettling, indifference. To him, this was a loss of everything. To her, it was simply justice. As the judge prepared to finalize the ruling, the ex-husband suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Wait," he said, his voice unsteady. The entire courtroom turned to him, curiosity and anticipation filling the air. His lawyer shot him a warning glance, but he ignored it. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, and he had only one option left. He had to make her reconsider. "I know things got complicated between us," he said, his tone forced, almost pleading. "Maybe I was too harsh, too dismissive. But we don't have to end things like this." He took a slow breath, trying to regain control. "You don't have to take half the company. We can negotiate. I can offer you a generous settlement, more than you would ever need." It was an attempt to buy her silence, to convince her that money was more valuable than justice. A long pause filled the room. Then, slowly, she stood. "You still don't get it, do you?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "This was never about money. It was about acknowledgement. About finally being seen for what I contributed." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And now that I have that, there's nothing left to discuss." Her words were not filled with anger, nor with spite. They were simply the truth. Her ex-husband's face darkened, his last hope slipping away. For years, he had controlled everything: his business, his reputation, and even his wife's perception of herself. But now, standing before him, was a woman he no longer recognized. A woman who had reclaimed her power. And no amount of negotiation, manipulation, or wealth could change that. He sank back into his chair, defeated. The judge tapped his gavel, signaling the official end of the trial. Lawyers gathered their papers, journalists whispered excitedly, and the courtroom slowly began to empty. The ex-wife remained in place for a moment, taking in the reality of what had just happened. This chapter of her life, one filled with dismissal and unspoken sacrifices, had finally closed. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight for. The ex-husband, however, sat motionless, staring at the documents that confirmed his loss. His fortune would be divided, his legacy would forever bear the mark of this trial, and the woman he had once belittled had walked away with more than just money. She had walked away with her dignity, her strength, and most importantly, her freedom. The weight of his own arrogance crushed him, but it was far too late to undo what had been done. The weight of the ruling settled over the ex-husband like an unbearable burden. He sat frozen in his chair as people exited the courtroom, their hushed whispers cutting into him like tiny daggers. Just hours ago, he had strutted into this trial convinced of his victory, fully expecting to humiliate the woman he had once called his wife. Now, he was the one drowning in humiliation, his reputation shattered, his wealth split in half. His lawyer patted his shoulder, murmuring something about appeals, but he barely registered the words. There was nothing left to appeal. The evidence had been undeniable, the verdict final. His ex-wife gathered her papers with quiet precision, her movements unhurried. There was no gloating, no last-minute taunts, only the quiet grace of a woman who had already won. She turned to leave, but for the first time in years, he saw her differently. Not as the woman he had dismissed or taken for granted, but as someone powerful, someone he no longer had control over. "Wait," he blurted, the word escaping before he could stop it. But she didn't wait. She didn't even glance back. She simply walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a reminder that he had lost far more than just money. The fallout from the trial reached his company like a shockwave. The board of directors, once unwaveringly loyal, now questioned his leadership. Investors, alarmed by the courtroom revelations, demanded reassurances. Rumors swirled, some whispered that his business decisions were not entirely his own, that perhaps the real strategist had been the woman he had so arrogantly dismissed. It didn't take long for cracks to form in the once untouchable empire he had built. Meetings turned tense. Employees exchanged nervous glances as they passed his office, sensing the shift in power. His authority, once absolute, now felt fragile. Every email, every decision, was scrutinized. It was a humiliating contrast to the dominance he had once held. He tried to maintain his composure, but deep down, the fear clawed at him. What if the people around him were starting to realize what he had worked so hard to deny? That without her, he wasn't as brilliant as he had pretended to be? Meanwhile, his ex-wife stood on the balcony of her new apartment, the crisp evening air brushing against her skin. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial settlements, and life-altering changes. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt light. Free. No longer bound by the suffocating weight of a marriage that had reduced her to nothing. The assets she had won weren't just compensation, they were proof that she had mattered, that her work had meant something. She ran her fingers over the edge of a document in her hands, one she had been considering carefully. Several companies had already reached out, offering positions, partnerships, even leadership roles. The irony wasn't lost on her. After being told for so long that she was nothing without her husband, the business world now recognized her worth. A small smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps it was time to stop thinking about what she had lost and start focusing on what she could build. This wasn't just a settlement. It was a second chance. The decline of his empire happened faster than he ever could have imagined. Investors grew wary, clients reconsidered their contracts, and for the first time in his career, he faced real resistance. He tried to ignore the signs, convincing himself that it was all temporary, but deep down, he knew the truth. Without his wife's strategic mind, the company was floundering. The foundation she had helped lay was solid, but his own leadership was proving insufficient. And worse, people were beginning to see through him. One evening, as he sat in his office staring blankly at the latest financial reports, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if she was the reason for his success all along? What if, without her, he was nothing more than a man playing the role of a businessman? His pride refused to fully accept it, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. He needed to act. He needed to fix this before it was too late. And for the first time in years, he found himself considering something he never thought he would, asking for her help. She wasn't surprised when she saw his name on her phone screen. If anything, she had been expecting it. She let it ring, watching as his number flashed insistently before vanishing into silence. The messages came next. At first, they were stiff, businesslike, an attempt to sound professional. We should discuss some business matters. Then they became more personal. We were good together once. Maybe we could find a way to work through this. She deleted them all without responding. But when she walked into a cafe one afternoon, she didn't expect to see him sitting there, waiting for her. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice carefully controlled. She simply raised an eyebrow. "That implies I have a reason to seek you out." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Look, I'll be direct. Our company, is struggling." He leaned forward. "I need you. We can work something out. A partnership, maybe." For the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his tone. Only desperation. She sipped her coffee, unfazed. "You need me," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he admitted. It was a small word, but it carried more meaning than he realized. It was an acknowledgement, a confession, a final, reluctant surrender. But as he watched her, waiting for some sign of hesitation, he saw none. She set her cup down gently, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Then you should have valued me when you had the chance." His heart sank. He had expected negotiations, discussions, a chance to regain some control. But she wasn't interested. She wasn't looking for revenge, nor was she moved by his desperation. She had simply outgrown him. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her coat, and with one last glance, she turned and walked away. He didn't call after her. He already knew there was nothing left to say. Without her, the cracks in his empire widened. Stocks fell, employees resigned, competitors seized the opportunity to overtake his business. His board of directors, once unwaveringly loyal, lost faith in him. Within months, he was forced to step down as CEO, his own company slipping from his grasp. The headlines were brutal: business mogul falls from grace, ex-wife's victory reshapes industry. He had spent years belittling her, erasing her contributions, pretending she was insignificant. Now, the world knew the truth. He watched from the sidelines as she thrived. She had taken her settlement and used it wisely, investing, expanding, carving a name for herself outside of his shadow. She became exactly what he had spent years convincing her she couldn't be: successful, independent, powerful. The realization was crushing. He had lost everything, not because she had taken it from him, but because he had never truly deserved it to begin with. She stood in the spacious office of her new company, gazing out at the city skyline with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The past months had been a whirlwind of opportunities, each one confirming what she had always known deep down: she was more than capable on her own. Her settlement had been more than just financial compensation, it had been a launching pad. She had invested wisely, made strategic moves, and now, she was not just successful, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her name was now recognized in business circles, not as someone's wife, but as a leader in her own right. She had built something for herself, something untouchable. She no longer needed validation, nor did she seek revenge. The past was simply a lesson, a necessary chapter in her story. And as she prepared to step into a meeting, one that would finalize her company's expansion into new markets, she smiled to herself. She had once sacrificed everything for someone else's dream. Now, she was building her own. Meanwhile, her ex-husband sat in his empty apartment, the silence pressing in on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The fall had been brutal. His name, once spoken with admiration, had become synonymous with failure. His company had survived, but without him at the helm. His former colleagues had distanced themselves, eager to align with stronger leadership. He had been replaced, forgotten. It was a reality he had never imagined: being irrelevant. The worst part wasn't even losing his wealth or his title. It was realizing that without the illusion of power, he had no real connections. The friends who had surrounded him had disappeared. The people who once flattered him now barely acknowledged his existence. And the woman he had spent years looking down on had risen higher than he ever thought possible. The realization gnawed at him, bitter and unrelenting. He had been given everything: loyalty, trust, a brilliant partner, and he had thrown it all away. One evening, as she wrapped up work, she received an unexpected email. The subject line was simple: "Can we talk?" She stared at the name beneath it, her ex-husband. She debated deleting it without reading, but curiosity won. The message was short, almost hesitant. He wanted to meet. No demands, no arrogance, just a simple request. She sat back, considering. She had nothing to gain from seeing him again, but perhaps there was something left to say. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, a stark contrast to the extravagant restaurants they once frequented. He looked different. The confidence that once defined him was gone, replaced by something more subdued, almost uncertain. "You look well," he said after a long silence. She simply nodded, waiting. He sighed, rubbing his hands together. I wanted to say that I see it now. What I did. What I lost." His voice wavered slightly. "And I'm sorry." For a moment, she simply observed him. There was no satisfaction in seeing him like this, no joy in his downfall. Once, she might have longed for this apology, for some acknowledgement of the years of dismissal and cruelty. But now, sitting across from him, she felt nothing. His regret, though genuine, no longer mattered. It would not change the past, nor did it affect her future. She had moved on. She had won, not by taking revenge, but by reclaiming her life. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her tone polite but distant. "But it doesn't change anything." His shoulders slumped slightly, as if he had expected this but still hoped for something more. "I know," he admitted. "I just needed to say it." There was another pause before she stood, gathering her things. "I hope you find peace," she said simply. And with that, she walked away, leaving him sitting there, alone with the weight of his choices. As she stepped outside, she felt nothing but clarity. She had no lingering bitterness, no desire to dwell on the past. The woman she had been, the one who sacrificed everything for someone who never truly saw her, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and in full control of her destiny. She didn't need closure from him because she had already given it to herself. She walked through the busy streets, blending into the rush of people, each one with their own stories, their own struggles and triumphs. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her, nor by the man who had once tried to diminish her. She was free. And that, more than any financial settlement or courtroom victory, was her greatest success. Her story was one of resilience, of self-worth rediscovered. She had spent years believing she was small, insignificant, nothing more than an accessory to someone else's success. But the truth had always been there, she had never been weak. She had simply been patient. And when the time came, she had shown the world, and herself, just how powerful she truly was. Her ex-husband, on the other hand, had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that he could take and take without consequence. But life had a way of balancing the scales. His downfall had not come from her revenge, nor from some outside force. It had come from his own arrogance, his own inability to see value in those who stood beside him. He had written her off as nothing, and in the end, it was his own insignificance that crushed him. Years later, as she stood in a boardroom filled with industry leaders, she realized just how far she had come. She was no longer someone's wife, no longer the woman overlooked in the shadows. She was a CEO, a visionary, a woman who had reclaimed her power and built something extraordinary. People listened when she spoke, respected her opinions, and sought her guidance. She had become everything she was once told she could never be. As the meeting ended and she stepped into the cool evening air, she thought back to the woman she had been when she first sat in that courtroom, facing the man who had tried to erase her. She smiled. That chapter was closed. A new one had begun, filled with endless possibilities. Because she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, She had always been enough. And now, the world finally saw it, too.